All right, so welcome to the Enterprise Serverless Adoption webinar. I'm your host, Ryan Jones. The company mentioned on this slide is Serverless Guru, your guide to serverless, as we like to say. So let's look at what we've got going. So the first thing that we want to cover is who is Serverless Guru? What do we do, just so there's a baseline of like where this information is coming from. So the first thing I'm going to call out is that, Serverless Guru, high level, we help companies innovate faster, reduce operational overhead, and streamline application development by leveraging serverless technologies. By using Serverless Guru to help you with your serverless initiatives, companies skip over the complexity and they lay a strong foundation so they can get to the benefits straight away, because it takes a long time, takes years in some cases to learn all the knowledge that you need to be effective, and it's always changing. And so it's kind of this race that you're constantly trying to keep up with. If you rely on consultants from the outside that have that knowledge already, whose job is to stay on that front line, that edge of innovation, stuff that's coming out of the serverless cloud native space, then you can save bandwidth on your end, incorporate us into your team's integration, have us help with training or consulting or literally doing service development. And that can end up supercharging the rest of the people on your team that have the domain specific expertise. And so on that note, let's keep going. A little bit about me. The CEO/CTO of Serverless Guru. I'm the co-host of the Talking Serverless podcast and the Serverless Economics podcast, author of the Serverless Zero to Paid Professional online course. We currently have, I believe, over 900 signups and maybe over 1,000 now of people that have signed up to take that course, which has been great. Definitely check that out on, I think it's training.serverlessguru.com. Also, my journey to serverless was somewhat unique. We talked about it quite a bit on the Talking Serverless podcast. And the high level of it is that I learned about serverless while also learned about AWS going through very early on in 2017. Out of that process of learning serverless, getting some development skill set combined with AWS and certifications, I ended up working in the innovation engineering department at Nike before eventually starting Serverless Guru in late 2018. So that's kind of been the progression there. 2017, learned that serverless was the future, doubled down, jumped in with both feet, stayed on that path, worked at Nike for about 8 months to a year, helping build out serverless applications and working with things like infrastructure as code, AWS, and then kind of use that knowledge to apply it to other companies around the space, just the general side of that. So, all right, so the first thing that we want to talk about when we think about enterprise serverless adoption, it's kind of this big, huge thing. So it's kind of like, we're going to break it down into chunks. The first thing is like a questionnaire. And also this is like our discovery phase, right? So this whole thing is going to be from the perspective of like, how would Serverless Guru approach a client where they want to do a serverless adoption at an enterprise scale with a big team? And how do we basically come in and understand what's going on enough to then recommend things? And so that's where the questionnaire and discovery comes from. So out of this, you have a couple of things. You have the high level context gathering. So for instance, we have team structure here. That would be one piece. Experience level with cloud, modern development practices, usage of CI/CD, infrastructure as code, automated testing, things like that. So the idea here is like, what is your team already doing? How does that team, like, how is it organized? It's like, is there silos around certain things, like operations is here, and you have developers and you have like support staff, like, or are they mixed together? Do you already have like cross-functional teams? What's the skill set inside those teams? Are they ready to take on all this cloud native stuff? If we start dropping CI/CD pipelines and all these other areas like canary deployments and things like that, are people going to be able to follow it? Do they already have that context already built up? And then based on that, we get a little bit more context at a very high level. Low level context gathering, this would be meeting with key teams. So this is where you're breaking out a presentation, slideshow, you're showing us the architecture diagram, you're showing us all the things that we might need as like almost being onboarded as if we were working, as an employee or something for the company. Diving into the code base. So one thing that, personally I hold it that, is true is that the ultimate source of truth is the code, right? And so a lot of stuff is just kind of high level talking, all that stuff, but the real thing, that the engine that makes the whole thing work, is the code. And so that's a big piece of like really understanding. We want to talk to people, we want to understand perspectives, but then at the end of the day, we want to know what is actually there and what's not actually there. And unfortunately, sometimes those two can kind of get mixed up when it's purely through talking. So once we get access to the code and we have access to the architecture diagrams and the other high level domain knowledge starting to be shared. Then we can say, okay, they've got this, they've got that, but they don't have this. And then we can identify those, draw a line around it, send it back like, hey, you said you had 3 different environments. We're seeing one environment being deployed, one environment with 3 different deployments happening to it, but it's not automated and there's a whole bunch of manual steps that are happening. And it turns out, oh, actually, I didn't know that. And then it's this whole discovery process, not only for Serverless Guru, but actually for the client themselves. They start learning about from this fresh perspective, what do we actually have? It's almost like an audit, I guess you could say. And then reviewing architecture design documentation, as I mentioned, and we start drafting improvements to drawing circles around stuff. And then we take those observations, all that information, and we basically present that back to client leadership. So we draft a document, we do a presentation, we might build something off of the back of this, which I think is our follow-on slides that we're getting into. But the key thing is that it's not just this one-way street where you're giving us information, we're just there in the meeting, and then hopefully you get something out of it. That entire time, we're going to be following up and asking questions, and that exchange of questions and trying to understand where you're coming from, that's extremely valuable, we found with our clients. Because that piece is, and we're not just quietly taking notes, we're actively engaged trying to figure out like why things are done in the way that they're done, for the betterment of the company, and then also, in general, just to be able to do our job. So that's questions, it's questionnaire and discovery. Moving on to what comes after that, we have tailored use case pattern development. So what this looks like is we're going to basically develop patterns. Just checking to make sure the mic is working properly. We're going to basically develop patterns to help on those areas that we found out about, right? So like, for instance, we noticed that, we had a missing CI/CD pipeline. We didn't have infrastructure as code the way that it needed to be. We weren't doing canary deployments or something. And maybe that's a sticky point, like really needs to be in there. And so what we'll do is we'll take all that information and then we'll start drafting patterns out of that. And so that's where the tailored use case pattern development comes from. It has to come after the discovery because first we need to know how to tailor it. And then once we have that information, then we can make the changes and we can build something out. So what does that look like, right? So a good pattern, right? Like this is a new thing. We want to hit the ground running. We want to make it impactful. We want to empower other people on the team. How do we do that? Well, the way that we think about it is we want to take that 80 to 90% service of functionality, right? So let's draw this boundary around, let's say, REST APIs, right? And so we know that, you have 500, 1,000 REST APIs that already exist. Maybe different endpoints, right? But for the most part, you have all these different things which are very similar to each other. And so instead of trying to tackle the entire thing, we're just going to draw a small slice of it. And that's at 80 to 90%. And so that might be, CRUD functionality with API gateway, which is a REST API, hosted REST API for Amazon Web Services. And then maybe a Lambda function, which is our backend like compute to basically host our code so we can actually handle the request coming in. And then maybe like DynamoDB, which is going to be our database, our NoSQL database, which will handle storing of, user data, account information, whatever that ends up being. And so we'll take that, we'll say, okay, we got API gateway, we got Lambda, and we have DynamoDB. We need a CI/CD pipeline, we need canary deployments, we need the full infrastructure as code flow. We try to basically map out the development workflow, no matter what. That's our foundation. And then on top of that, we then add like the 80 to 90% that's relevant to the actual functionality that would be built for other services, right? So if you have 100 APIs and you're going to try to have your 2-3 developers chop those up and then be able to work and migrate them to this cloud native serverless architecture, they need to feel like they have what they need. They need the tools, right? So the idea of this is not to fully move something in this point. It's more to build a baseline so that we can set up for training. And so that's what we kind of get in down here. Training and accelerating service migration, because once that foundation is there and once the developers on the team have the tools, then they can just start working on it. And ultimately that like hands-on knowledge is where all the neural pathways are going to connect together, and all the developers will then learn a lot faster. We'll have a baseline to be able to like talk from there. Next, following this is basic tool training and pattern training. So we just built the pattern. We did the discovery. We learned about what's going on with the company. We learned about like what wants to be built. We learned where the gaps are. Then we developed a pattern. And now we're going to do actually tool training around the pattern. So what tools did we use to build the infrastructure as code, the CI/CD pipeline? Why did we structure our Lambda functions that way? And so it's not just a pure, like, we're going to build a CRUD API and it's just going to respond back and it's like 30 lines of code. No, we're going to try to mix in like real What's the logging functionality we would be using? What is the monitoring that we would be using? What does the development local testing look like? All those things that are like the things that you need that aren't so clear when you start working, right? Like there's a lot of, like they say, there's a lot of hello world articles out there, but there's not a lot that get into like what is the daily life of a serverless developer look like. And that's what this whole training segment is here. And because we got that information around the 80 to 90% that's relevant, it could be REST API, it could be GraphQL, whatever it ends up being. Because we have that now, we can then build that pattern and then we can train people on it. And it's relevant enough that it really works. So let's talk about what that looks like. So basic tool training, like I said, ISC frameworks, other tools, local testing, CI/CD, basically condensing years of our learning combined across our 20 plus consultants around the world into a happy path, right? The happy path is like, I believe this was Gary Jennings that talked about this, that worked with us for quite a while and still somewhat involved. Is the happy path, which is basically like, what are the things that we can do to basically like shorten the feedback loop and just like, I want to start as if I had 2 years of experience already. And so we can basically lay it out like, use this for local testing, use this when you do CI/CD pipelines, use this when you write the infrastructure as code, break your code apart this way, do repos if it's this case, use multiple repos if it's this case, right? All those little areas that like you can kind of identify and just like make it easy, right? Like if you have 3 developers working on a project, then break it out to a separate repository. If you have security requirements, then do this, right? And then familiarize developers with common commands and usage. So that's what local testing looks like. That's what individual function deployments look like. There's a lot of things like when you're debugging infrastructure as code, for instance, you might need to print out the template to see if the dynamic variables are compiling properly. All that stuff really helps to know about. And a lot of times we end up finding when we do these trainings, we're like, yeah, you can run like this serverless CLI command and it'll basically give you back the logs, or it'll print it out, or you can do local testing through this, and it kind of does this local emulation. A lot of times people don't know that, and so when we show them that, it's super helpful. Demonstrating service development, workflow, and testing. So this is the idea of like, I say development workflow a lot because I think it's the most critical thing. If you have development workflow really good, that means your developers can move quickly, they can build stuff fast, and they don't have to worry about all the little stuff. Like when you get into trying to emulate the cloud locally, like past something like a Lambda function or past something like an API gateway, once you get really deep into a lot of the other AWS services, you end up spending so much time doing that, and then it's out of date. And then what do you do 6 months or a year from now? Or what does it look like 5 years from now? And a lot of times we're solving like these problems because they're interesting today that have no real business value. And so the idea is like, let's give the recommendation, like the happy path of development workflow around testing, around all these things. Let's demo it. Let's give the development team like the confidence that if they actually followed this, it would work. And then from there, we've seen a lot more buy-in happen versus like something where like, do this, do this. It's like when we actually demo it and people can see it working, it helps a lot. Pattern trainings, the line by line review. So we take the basic tool training, go one step further. This would be an overview of how it's built with the infrastructure as code, the components. Like I said a second ago, when you take infrastructure as code, and let's say we're going to have like, a whole bunch of DynamoDB tables, a whole bunch of Lambda functions, we're going to have API gateway, we're going to have like Elasticsearch, we're going to have all these resources, all this stuff mixed in. The infrastructure as code, if you wrote it in like, let's say CloudFormation, huge, we're talking like thousands of lines, right? And then you talk about least privilege, right? Like doing security properly, all these things. And so the core thing that we can do here is that we can basically show how we would handle least privilege permissions in the infrastructure as code, how we would break things apart by like ephemeral versus non-ephemeral resources. So like if you deleted the Lambda function, what's the impact, right? And the impact is like minimal. It's like, it's not a lot. And the reason why it's minimal is because all your code doesn't live on AWS. Like it does, but it's a copy of the code that's in your source repository. And so if you delete that Lambda function, the impact is minimal. You can spin it back up if you have good infrastructure as code, because it's basically a blueprint of that Lambda function. It says where to get the code from. You have a deployment pipeline to redeploy it. However, if you delete a database, it's much different, right? You don't have that user data stored somewhere else. Hopefully you have backups. Hopefully you should, absolutely. But if you don't have backups, or if that backup is an hour late, or not an hour late, but if it was done like every hour, or if it's done every day, you might have this like this gap where like something took place, and you ended up like deleting your database, and that's no good. And so why would that happen, right? You might go like, that shouldn't happen, right? But the thing is that when you put all of your resources into one single stack, they're all connected together. And so if you try to change your Lambda function, but then there's some weird issue with the database, every time you're updating the Lambda function, you're updating the database, and you can have something happen where maybe something's off on the database, or maybe somebody pushed a change that they shouldn't have, and it doesn't get caught because it's all in the same structure. And so we basically, from the get-go, tell you how to separate all that stuff out so that you limit the impact. Because even for people that have been doing this for a long time, it's very easy to like trip up, fall into a ditch basically around around deleting resources that you shouldn't. So the more times that you kind of proactively think about like what might happen and then plan today to basically mitigate that, the better. And so that's the way that we structure stuff and think about it. Walking developers through how they can replicate. This is kind of once they get to the point where they have the basic tool training done, they've seen the demos of how their development workflow might change, they've seen the line by line review, there's some confidence, there's some buy-in happening. And now it's a matter of how can I empower that person that's listening to the training actually then go out and start building a service. And so that's the next part that we show. So we have the existing service migration pattern. So we talked about this like 80 to 90% pattern. We're mostly just focusing on the resources, the AWS, just the development workflow, not so much the specific context of your company, just those little details. And while I'm talking about this, by the way, I forgot to flag this. I'm talking about this from the perspective, how does Serverless Guru approach it? You could easily take your own internal team. You could build a team called like the Cloud Center of Excellence, right? That's the coin term at this point. The Cloud Center of Excellence team could be a whole bunch of people, both from leadership and from people that are individual contributors, like from the development team or the operations team that are passionate about AWS, serverless. Combine them together, maybe 2 or 3 people, and then you can start doing exactly what I'm talking about here, holding trainings, identifying the 80 to 90% service, right? It is possible for you to do this on your own. So like, although I'm talking from the perspective of how Serverless Guru as a consulting company would approach it, this could easily be followed if you have the right setup internally. And we've seen this happen at like places like lego.com, for instance. Okay, so 80-90% service that we identified, the functionality of it, the core functionality of it, it is a REST API, right? Not a REST API that then does like account information. So we identified the basic core functionality previously, built a pattern for it, trained on it. Now we have this idea of let's migrate it for you. And so the idea here is that all this stuff is going to be so new that we've seen a lot of pushback happen where when we say, okay, you've got the pattern, it's got a REST API, you've got the infrastructure as code, you've got an idea for how the deployment pipeline works. Now take your service that's part of this monolith, right? And then migrate it over. And it becomes one of those things where it's like, it's easier said than done, because like once you get into the process, you start identifying gaps. And we found out that like, if we only do just the tailored pattern part and the training, it doesn't go far enough. And we hear what people describe as their goals for their initiatives. They want this to roll out in a month, right? They want that first service win in less than a month or in a month. And so to do that, this is where we offer now migrate it for you. So we're going to help learn the nuances of how your team builds services just in general, right? We're going to use that to also improve the training material. So it's all this like, it's all a cycle, right? Like we basically learn something and we give that back to the system, and then it gives training and that comes back to the system. And the idea of through all this entire, like if I had the most idealistic way of like viewing consulting, it would be that we come in, we basically share the ways that we do stuff, and these like little nuances and stuff, and the way that we think about feeding that information always back into training, always back into knowledge sharing. And then basically have the company basically pick that up internally and have their own people build that out. So it's something like at the companies that we worked with, we'll find an case, for instance, the SQS FIFO queue is like going down in production. And so in a lot of ways, what usually happens is that someone will fix the problem and then they'll walk away from it. That's it. The way that we think about it is that we'll fix the problem and then we'll make a template out of it, and then we'll write an article about it, and then we'll make a video about it, and then we'll share it out to the entire team doing an @here message we're those people. Send it out to 30 plus people across all time zones, basically saying, here's a video of how this works. Here's what happened. This is how we solved it. Here's a document about how it works. And we do that for everything. We try to do that for everything. And so the goal there is that if we do it, then it can replicate out to the other people on the team that see the value in it. Then leadership can get buy-in from it, and they can say, you know what, I like the way what they're doing. I'm going to encourage that. And ultimately, it's a huge culture shift. So like underpinning the serverless adoption is also a change in culture. So I just wanted to flag that one. So we use this knowledge to improve training material. As I said, we move from abstract communication to how your team actually understands it. Take the C#, .NET service, do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10, then deploy it using these commands, and you should see something running, right? Like if it's using this structure, here's how it's been broken down. Here's a repository of how it works. And now we can do like training and have conversations with the team that's like very specific, because most of the time, the way services get built on one application or one segment is going to be the same in other segments. And so the second that we have the ability to apply our training and then also like how we view like service development, and then we can actually understand that process, we take it from like training wheels, we take the training wheels off, and now they're riding a bike type of thing. Okay, so service migration pattern training, I hinted at this just a second ago. So the result of service migration training is that developers can replicate our setup for their own services. So that's like that's the goal of all of this, right? Independent people building and migrating things in parallel, right? And so that's how we've gotten to that point. We started off with like, understanding the context. We then moved to, a very like 80 to 90% use case pattern that we developed, to basic tool training and talking about that, to then migrating a service. And then now we're doing the service training around the service that we migrated. So those steps are incremental and they're deliberate. And so we meet with the development team where they are, as we talked about. So now we're speaking the same language. We know about all these third-party integrations that no one wanted to bring up initially because it was kind of scary to talk about. And so now we know about that. We know where the bodies are. And so we can have real conversations that we couldn't have previously, because it goes from like idealistic to like reality, right? And that's totally fine. And it needs to happen. So service migrations can happen in parallel with this pattern as the blueprint. So we've seen this happen. We migrate the service. We've done the full process. There's a baseline understanding. And then now it's like, all right, now it's your turn. Pick up the service, migrate it over, migrate these 5 APIs, use the service we've already built as a blueprint to do it. And if you need anything, you can reach out to us. So now we get into the really fun stuff. We're doing the parallel service migrations. Stuff is actually working at this point. The people are actually, this is like when it gets really fun, because now you start seeing services get migrated. You see people actively developing with using the serverless toolset, cloud native toolset. They're gaining confidence. And there is something where like, just why consulting, why train, why, it's like employee retention as well, right? Like there's an employee retention element to it, where if you're able to create environments where the work is challenging, people are learning, and it's actually like very engaging, which I would say this entire process is that we've just described, people are going to feel really great, because ultimately my viewpoint is that serverless cloud, whether it's going to be serverless or called cloud native or be called cloud, it's going to define the future of software development. So we're already on the path. We're already headed that direction. So if your company is able to teach and show people how to do that, and you're on that forefront, you're going to attract talent from all around the world. I've seen it happen at many different places, because those people that are on that front edge, those really quality hires, they're looking for companies that are taking that type of initiative seriously today, right? And right now it's still you're very easily able to start on this path and then start recruiting quality talent, because you'll be able to say, hey, we're hiring for a service developer at XYZ company, and that's going to get on a lot of people's radar because it's still a very small pond. Yeah. All right, so we move quickly at this point. So we've invested early, we laid a solid foundation, we took the due diligence steps, we did our discovery, we did the use case blueprint pattern, we did the basic tool training. We didn't just jump straight into helping you migrate a service without having any idea and just like build the plane while it's falling. Like we didn't do that. We took the necessary steps. We built, a kite, and then we built, a paraglider, and then we built a plane, and so on. So now we let the development team pick up the services in parallel, as we said. they can now multiply and use the patterns as a baseline. So this is like really amazing stuff. And so just kind of touching on this point again. Now, like I said, I hinted at this a minute ago, as these developers get going, they're going to hit problems, they're going to hit hiccups, and they're going to need support. And so the idea is not just like, here's serverless and like drop a rock from like 1,000 feet up and like hopefully they catch it. It's like the goal is basically as they get going, they're going to have like support, and we're going to have a support structure that's there to help them. So as questions come up, we're there. And it's just a reality of like, even the best training, even moving something, like moving a pattern over, there's always going to be some like edge case things that pop up. And so we just have to be very honest and be like, the development team will hit barriers and roadblocks. We know this. We plan for it by having ongoing support already in place. So they already know who to dial. They already have a Slack channel already there. There's already a process around how people can create tickets to then communicate to the Serverless Guru team to then help them when they're running into these issues. All that stuff has already been thought about ahead of time. And so now it's like they can execute independently. And if there's questions, they can report back. So as developers hit problems, like we said, we have an automated support tracking to triage. So this is something that, it's very early. I think we said that we were going to announce it in April, but it's the end of March, so it's pretty close. But we have something that we're working on right now at sls.support. So it's basically a support platform that we're building for exactly what I'm talking about here. If you have your own Cloud Center of Excellence team, you are making your own serverless enterprise adoption initiative move forward, and you already have that internal stuff, but then you just want somebody to dial when like stuff's going wrong, just to speed up your developers. Instead of trying to have that developer spend 8 hours going through GitHub issues, testing things, trialing it out, or you can spend like 5 minutes and then message one of us and then get a response back if we actually seen it or give you a recommendation on how to proceed. That can save 8 hours of time. So there's real cost savings there. So we're building something. It's a serverless support platform at sls.support. And it's based on doing this process for companies. We've just basically taken that knowledge and then we're now turning it into a product to some degree. So if you're interested in that, I think you can reach out. You can contact us through that website. It'll ping us and then we can start the conversation from there. All right, edge case pattern development and training. So what does this look like? Edge cases come up. We want to keep the developers focused on building the product. So how we do that is that if a problem comes up, we're going to create a new pattern around that edge case. So I mentioned the SQS FIFO example. That's a really good one. That's a real thing that, exactly what I wanted to talk about here. So we share the patterns with the entire development team. So we make the pattern, how to handle SQS FIFO and how to make sure that we can handle more than like one request a second or one request, at a time. Whatever that looks like. I don't remember the exact problem that came through in production, but we built a pattern around it. We shared it to the entire team. We recorded a video for it. We did documentation for it. And then there was other areas actually where other teams were also working with SQS FIFO queues. And we were able to basically proactively, before they even got into production, help them solve what they would have hit based on their traffic estimations from moving from a different queue system. Like they knew that it would happen, but they didn't know that this other area took place already and happened. And so what we ended up doing is that because we developed those materials and because we shared those back out, we learned of these other teams that were also doing the same thing independently of each other and not communicating. And we were basically able to reach over and be like, hey, here's this pattern, here's this video for how it works. The way that you're building this right now, if you go down this path in production, we might hit the exact same thing we've hit here. So if you make this one tweak of the configuration, we should be set. And that probably saves, I think when production issues go down at enterprise, there is a lot of people on those phone calls and those people get paid a lot of money to be there. And so, I don't know what the cost of one outage is, but it's probably quite the number because you have some cases 10, 15, 20 people plus on a call, all trying to scramble, all talking over each other, trying to figure out like how to proceed. So obviously that's like one thing I've seen like enterprises do this. It shouldn't be that way to begin with. Like if we had to go to the root problem, it's actually because the deployment process is not great. But if problems happen and it's still that early phase of like enterprise serverless adoption and they're not all the way to that point where they're past all those internal things, that's very likely to happen even during a serverless adoption, depending on how the enterprises set up. Provide the recordings out. And like I said, if this goes well, developers stay focused more on the product, which means faster feature delivery. It means successful sprints. It means products being delivered. The higher up management promised that it would be done by, let's say February 7th. It actually gets done by February 7th. You don't have to push that out. It's good for management. It's less stressful for the development team. It basically gives a way for like a lifeline when things are going wrong. Successful serverless adoption. So we got through this whole process, right? We talked about it. We did the parallel service migration. The team's been working with the tools for a couple of months now, right? They've been able to migrate all the services over. And now 3 months, 4 months, 6 months later, they're developing their own services and they're all working independently and they're finding new things and they're bringing that back to the team, right? Successful serverless adoption. Let's talk about it. Developers are independently building new services. Knowledge is retained inside the teams. Services have been migrated and optimized services. Overhead and maintenance has been dramatically reduced. So doing this whole process, cutting out other things, switching to a DynamoDB versus doing like a relational database or switching from a Mongo to a DynamoDB could have cost savings there. Developers are focused on the product. So they're no longer focused on all the underlying pieces that have to happen. And it's not so much just like they have a lifeline with a serverless support, but when we think about like how do you build traditional applications with virtual machines or containers, where we actually own that entire process from like end to end, that process is a lot. And so the more time we spend trying to make a super good container or a really good AMI for our EC2 instance, the more time we spend there, it's like for the people that are working there, it's great because that's like, it's great for them, but like ultimately that's not what the product actually is, right? So you want scaling. And so there's other options out there. Like if serverless can scale to the scaling that you need and you don't have to manage any of it, that is the better solution. Like I'm kind of like I'm like a serverless zealot, I guess, like in that way. Hopefully I'm using that word right. But yeah, I think that's the area where I draw the line there. It's like my view of it, like a serverless first mindset, is that use the thing that has the least overhead that will get the business goal done the fastest first. And then if you hit edge case problems, then redefine the strategy. Okay, the scale of this, the third party dependency that we're using, we need to use a container, right? So but you start at the simple solution and then you move backwards from there. And I see a lot of companies who start the opposite way and then they have to try to justify why serverless. And it's like, well, because you're just using a CRUD API, right? Like you don't have to run Express through a container. Anyways, culture has been influenced to share knowledge. So I think what this looks like here is that this was that underpinning side of it, is that as like things are happening, as new tool sets are being built up, as less overhead is happening, it's like people start communicating with each other more. They start learning skills. They start looking out to the community. They feel that feeling of like I'm on the front line and helping build this new initiative for the company, and they're just excited, right? And so that culture starts building of wanting to take a little bit more risk with stuff, wanting to like introduce new things, and all that's a really big benefit to the business as well, because the type of things that people will introduce when they're organically going out there and just like looking for stuff and feeling like they will be supported when they do that, opens up tons and tons of doors. And I think one example of that is maybe like Google's like 80/20 time, where I believe that the Google Calendar, either Google Calendar or Gmail or one of those, came out of the fact of like having 80/20 time and just encouraging people to have an idea, share the idea, and then have time to be able to like work on the idea and then see if it's valid or not. So at this point, when you have the application parts done, when you have some of the confidence in like serverless and like in this whole initiative, and you're at this point, this is when now you can start moving into identifying other processes inside the company. And I feel like this is also the point when the culture starts to really show signs of like blossoming into something different. Excuse me. So what comes next, right? We did a serverless adoption. Excuse me one second. Okay, so we got through the enterprise serverless adoption successfully. And so now, what do? Well, we don't stop. That's the big thing, right? So like, I think a lot of times, we're like high-fiving at this point. It's great, but I think we also need to keep, the eye on the ball and the fact that there's more to do. There's always more to do. So, excuse me. So now we turn our attention at internal processes that always get shelved. So maybe that's like maybe it's the deployment pipeline that we talked about, but maybe there's some other department where they're doing things in a way that it could be automated. There could be scripts there, right? Like maybe they're copying all this data over. And if it was faster, done better, then those people could focus on things that were higher impact, right? And so that's what I really love about this whole process. I love identifying areas for optimizations and efficiency, right? I'm a good worker, a worker ant in that case. Like I like identifying inefficiencies and trying to solve them. And serverless allows to take away, all the stuff that I had to worry about before, so I can just focus on like improving the day to day, the stuff that really makes an impact, and matters to like the end result, right? Because it's like one of those things where like example of that is like Excel spreadsheet, right? Like you have the data in the Excel spreadsheet. Really, it's how you modify and manipulate the data inside the spreadsheet. But getting the data into the spreadsheet doesn't actually matter, right? So like that part, if it was automated and if it was one click, amazing, right? But if you did it manually, there's no real difference there, right? So the things like that, if you identify those things and you say, okay, what's the most important? Trying to figure out how to manipulate the data to then find some insight. And then you spend all your time doing that, and you spend little to no time doing the other part. And the results over the multiple months of doing that, can start to snowball. Identifying areas that the entire development team can improve on. So maybe it's the CI/CD pipeline, as we mentioned. Maybe it's application development. Maybe this whole process realizes like most of the team needs training not only on serverless development and AWS, but also on modern Node.js development and like how to use async await and promises and like how to like when do you break it out to a function versus like when do you break it out to separate functions? How do you share code across different repositories, or just how do you share code across like different Lambda functions? How do you organize all that stuff? There could be different areas that are completely unrelated that can come out of this process of you've tackled all these other things. So then now you get to work on other areas, which is great. We work with architects as well to design and build new serverless services. So as I said, you've migrated the stuff, people are building independently. How does Serverless Guru stay involved, right? Like how does Serverless Guru like change? And that, it's not just like we got you over the finish line, now it's done. A lot of times what ends up happening is that process of that 2, 3, 6 month journey was almost like building this trust relationship that we're like almost a digital partner now moving into the future, where you trust that we're going to think about the future, we're going to raise our opinion when we have it, we're going to push back on the organization if we think that there is another option that could be explored. And out of that, we then end up moving into roles like helping on the architecture side. And this would be the same thing for a Cloud Center of Excellence team at your company. It would basically be like this Cloud Center of Excellence team, they helped on a lot of other stuff before, but now they've got all the videos, they've got all the documents. And so now they're working with like architects to then help them on how they should structure certain things. And this could just be like, the Cloud Center of Excellence in this case is like a group of people that have potentially the most knowledge about how AWS and serverless is implemented at your company, right? And so those people could work with an architect at an existing team just to basically add like cover fire, right? Like when they're trying to make decisions, when they need sign off, when they need validation, that's where this team can come in. And that's a role that we also fill as well. Building tooling, training to further improve development workflows. So as I said, development workflows again. Tooling, this could be like some companies will build their own IC framework. I don't recommend doing that, but I do see companies do that. I do see companies building out like basically like a abstraction over the other abstractions specific to their company, just so they can add in their own like mix of like security requirements and other things like that. And that's a very normal thing. It's like, for instance, if you're running a virtual machine, like let's say it was like MTLS, right? And you had to run like a EC2 instance or something, and it's a client certificate and a server certificate, and it needs to be on all servers that are hosting, an API or whatever that ends up looking like. And so instead of just having each person kind of like replicate that, they might create an abstraction over the top, or like if you build an EC2 instance, it already has that involved. And like obviously that's a bad example, but I think it's coming across what I mean. So anyways, that's the thing, is that we don't stop, we keep going. This is all a consistent journey of growth and continuous learning. Yeah, I think that's it. So this has been this has been a full rant. Let me dial back to the beginning so y'all can see a little bit more information. But like I said, Serverless Guru helps companies innovate faster, reduce operational overhead, streamline application development by leveraging serverless technologies. We work with clients to help them move across that journey faster. And just with support, right? So it's that you want it to work the first time. You know what I mean? You don't want it to take 2-3 times. You don't want to rework something, and to do that, you need people around you that are trusting and that know the frontline information. So on that note, let's go to the Q&A side. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and see if we have any questions. So if you do have a question, just drop it into the chat, and I will see it. I'll try to answer. What are the aspects you find are the hardest for organizations to adopt and learn? I think human to human interaction is probably the it's probably the one there. I think a lot of times the trickiest part of these adoptions is understanding how to communicate effectively with other people on the team and bring them into projects, restructure things so it's a mix of stuff, and how to navigate the nuance of making people feel like they have buy-in while also making sure that the initiative moves forward, right? And so like that is a very delicate game of I guess like human to human interaction that has to be done. And so I think there is a way to navigate that where people are like, when you're saying, like, let's do a serverless initiative and you have a team of operations, there's 13, 15 operations people, and they're going, okay, well, what happens with my job, right? Like, is my job gone now because I'm not managing the database anymore? And that's a very delicate conversation that has to be handled very carefully. And a lot of times it's not. And what can end up happening is that operations person that's been there for 10 years or 5 years, 7 years will feel like they don't, like the company doesn't care about them anymore. And it's just about this newest trend thing that's happening. They don't see the benefit of it. The company didn't explain why why this is a good thing for them too. And those people end up leaving. And so you have 7 years of domain expertise, 7 years of understanding how the organization works, all this stuff basically fly out the window because the company didn't do what their responsibility is, which is basically recognizing the value in people that have been there for a long time, and then figuring out how to basically bring them along for the ride. And those conversations are hard to navigate. And I think it absolutely takes learning for sure. I've seen it done the wrong way, and I've seen people quit that I've actually had people quit when I've joined companies before as a consultant. And I've seen, I've come in, I've started introducing a whole bunch of stuff. I started doing the development workflows. I started building out automation for things, started encouraging the usage of cloud native tooling, all that stuff. And I've seen operations people leave as a direct result of it, just quit basically because they questioned their job, and then the org didn't back them up, and that was not great. Dev workflows and sharing knowledge. Oh, you mean from that? Yeah, I would say sharing knowledge. I was just sharing knowledge and leadership. There's I don't know how much I want to go on a rabbit hole on that, but basically there's leaders, and then there's people that have the role of being a leader, right? And there's a huge difference there. And I think that goes back to my last point, which is it's very important to handle those conversations delicately and think about the downstream impact of losing somebody that has 7 to 10 years of domain expertise in that specific area, and then not trying to figure out a way for it to work with that person into the future. And that's probably the biggest one. If you did that right, this is just, it's all the same stuff, right? You had previously, you had on-premise, and you had servers, right? And then you had virtual machines that were servers, and then you had containers, which is a server, and there's a small isolated version of that inside of that server. And then now you have cloud functions, and it's inside of a container that's inside of a server that's on premises at AWS somewhere, right? Somewhere in the country. So it's all the same stuff. The fundamentally it hasn't changed. Like there's no new, we're not using like supercomputers and stuff anymore. Like we're not using supercomputers to do it now, or like quantum mechanics to like send data, to upload Instagram photos. It's the same stuff. These people understand the low level knowledge of it. And if you can bring them along for the ride, it's going to make the entire adoption much smoother. And when that person left, and then everybody was scrambling to figure out what do we do, every time a problem happened, that was the person we relied on. Now they're gone, and then now everybody's just scrambling, chickens with their head cut off. It delayed the thing by like multiple months. They didn't have a solid replacement for that person. They put way too much reliance on that person in general, which you can comment on. But the big thing is like, if there was a way for that person to stay involved, to then help transition, and then feel like they are also part of that transition. If you can do that effectively, I feel like your chance of a successful adoption of anything goes up quite a lot. So is there any other questions out there? Answer before we come to a close, it looks like. I'll give a little bit. Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody for showing up. Thanks so much for coming out, showing support. If you have any questions, if you have any follow-ups, definitely reach out to us. You can hit us up at serverlessguru.com. We've got contact pages there. You can message us directly if you wanted to DM us on Twitter. If you wanted to send us an email about pretty much anything, you can just reach out to info@serverlessguru.com. From there, we'll pick it up. We'll have conversations. We'll talk about whatever it ends up looking like you need. And thank you so much for listening. This has been Serverless. This has been Serverless Guru. Let me share the screen one more time, just so we can close out effectively. Okay. Here we go. Yes. So this has been Ryan Jones from Serverless Guru, and this has been the webinar on enterprise serverless adoption. And of course, as it says there, your guide to serverless. So if you're going to take on something like this and you need somebody in your corner, definitely reach out to us, and we can go from there. All right, perfect. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.